Welcome to this American Enterprise Institute event called Identity Required: How Pro-Social Identity Fosters Desistance from Crime. For those of you who are new to AEI, we are a nonpartisan think tank committed to making the intellectual, moral, and practical case for expanding freedom, increasing individual opportunity, and strengthening the free enterprise system in America and around the world. Our event today explores the question of whether we have a fundamental misunderstanding of what's required to deter and prevent criminal behavior. The American criminal justice system has tended to favor either a punishment or a rehabilitation paradigm. Police, courts, and prisons exist to remove criminals from the streets, isolate them from the rest of society, and deter future criminal behavior. Prisons try to do this through the weight and memory of incarceration, or by intervening through various programmatic efforts to change criminal behavior from the outside. Today's conversation will focus on whether we have available to us a third, somewhat different approach that leverages the internal psychological, emotional, and developmental processes common to all human beings to help people transition from criminal to pro-social identities. Our speaker, Dr. Shawn Bushway, will lay out the case he developed in a recent AEI paper entitled Reentry, Desistance, and Identity Achievement. In this paper, he develops the argument that of pro-social identities as a spouse, as a mother or father, as a worker or as a student, how these new identities can supplant and replace criminal identity and stop criminal behavior. If this theory is correct, we would be able to reduce crime and recidivism neither by deterrence nor conditioning, but by encouraging and supporting a transformation of how people see themselves as members of society. Today's panel consists of policy researchers, practitioners in the criminal justice and reentry field who are passionate about effective solutions to these problems. As I mentioned, Dr. Bushway will be our lead speaker. He is a senior policy researcher at the RAND Corporation and a professor of public administration and policy at the Rockefeller College of Public Affairs and Policy at the State University of New York in Albany. In his career, he's published over 80 peer-reviewed papers on criminal justice topics and serves as a fellow of the American Society of Criminology and the Committee on Crime, Law, and Justice for the National Academy of Sciences. Rashawn Ray is a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution, a professor of sociology at the University of Maryland, and the executive director of the Lab for Applied Social Science Research at the University of Maryland, College Park. Dr. Ray has published over 50 books, articles, and book chapters, and roughly 50 op-eds, primarily on the topics of racial and social inequality, police-civilian relations, how inequality may be attenuated through racial uplift activism, and other topics related to social policy. Our third speaker is Bret Bucklen, and he's the Director of Planning, Research, and Statistics for the Pennsylvania Department of Corrections. He previously served in the Pennsylvania Governor's Office of Administration, where he worked on projects related to probation and parole, corrections, state policy and crime, and delinquency. Dr. Bucklen holds an MS in Public Policy and Management from Carnegie Mellon and a PhD from the University of Maryland. Finally, Julio Medina is the founder of the Exodus Transitional Community, a reentry organization that has served over 10,000 participants in New York City and upstate New York. In 2004, Julio's work with returning citizens was highlighted in the Presidential State of the Union address, and in 2016, he was awarded the White House Champions of Change Award. Julio holds a BA from SUNY Albany, a Master of Divinity from New York Theological Seminary, and he's currently pursuing a PhD in ministry. Our program today will go as follows. Dr. Bushway will be giving us a presentation that covers the content of his paper. And then we'll hear responses from Dr. Ray, Dr. Bucklen, and Julio, and how they think about his work in relationship to their own, where they agree, where they might disagree. Then we'll have a panel discussion. I will try to pull together some of the threads of the conversation, and then we'll have an opportunity for you to ask questions as well, which you can do. You can see in the banner there at the bottom of the screen. You can submit questions to Hunter Dixon at aei.org or on Twitter at #AEI Desistance. So with no further ado, we're going to get started, and I'm going to turn the presentation over to Shawn Bushway.
Hi. So thanks for the introduction, Brent, and I'm very excited to be here. This work on identity started with my good friend and mentor, Ray Paternoster at the University of Maryland, in an important paper that was published in 2009. Unfortunately, Ray passed away in 2017, and this is one of the first times I've really re-engaged with the topic since his death, and I really appreciate the opportunity to continue working in his legacy and developing these ideas that have turned out to be quite powerful in this area of desistance. So next slide. So the concept of reentry is about 21 years old now. I love this picture, not only because it's a rank ordering of height from left to right, from Lori Robertson to Amy Solomon to Jeremy Travis to Janet Reno to Eric Horton. Sorry, Eric. Blinking. I just blanked. Holder, sorry, I blanked out his last name. I practiced ahead of time. Anyways, and these are, reentry wasn't even a word really that was used in referring to people exiting prison until Janet Reno sort of focused Jeremy's attention on this issue. And then Jeremy sort of wrote the important piece that said, hey, look, they all come back. And all of these people have been instrumental in creating a policy discussion around this, leading to the Second Chance Act and other things such that reentry is now sort of a corner of the realm. And it's hard to overstate the impact that reentry had on the general conversation about incarceration in the United States. I think it's not at all an overstatement to say that reentry as a concept is responsible for the sort of now consensus that we incarcerate too many people. However, I think it's also fair to say that there's a growing consensus that reentry itself, instead of just the things that it instigated, has hit a bit of a lull. So next slide. So it's in some sense failure to launch. It's no longer, even though it's now 21, it hasn't fully matured as a concept that we really understand how to make this work. So and so as a result, there's been a number of papers and books recently by a very assorted groups that sort of tried to rethink how we're thinking about this. So AEI had a book in 2020 that Brent put together. NIJ recently released a volume of documents on desistance that's focused specifically on policy applications. And the National Academy of Sciences is also working on a volume right now, specifically trying to focus attention on issues of recidivism, how it's measured, and how might we be more focused on success. And so there's lots of opinions about what to do, given that there is a sense in which we really haven't solved the problem of reentry. And so everyone else has an opinion, and so do I. So next slide. So the conversation today is about what I've written in this chapter about my ideas about how reentry can be reinvigorated and how we might be able to make progress moving forward. And I'm going to talk about three separate things. The first is, I think it's important that we measure success/failure correctly. In other words, I don't think the conversation that currently stands vis-a-vis, the revolving door of prison is actually accurate. And I think that's an important thing to correct. The second thing is, I don't think fundamentally the term reentry is helpful, because I think it's fundamentally about the entry of people into society rather than the reentry. I don't think prison has sort of disconnected people. I think a lot of people aren't connected in the first place. And then finally, I think what's missing in policy is that we're not aligned with the current theories of desistance that have sort of received the most attention or the most support. And so I want to talk about what it would take to align reentry policies with the identity theory of desistance, which is now has reached consensus as being an important way of thinking about desistance. Next slide. So I think anybody that's familiar with this area is used to these kind of reports from the Bureau of Justice Statistics. There's a headline, about recidivism, and it says things like, 82% of people that were released in a given year, in this case 2008, were rearrested within 10 years, and in this case 61% of people returned to prison for one reason or another within 10 years. So this creates an image of failure, that basically everyone's going to fail, and so they're highly risky, and we need to, we're failing. But I think that's actually a misperception. Next slide. So I have written down here 2 questions that ask the same sort of thing about recidivism, in this case, failure. So the first question is, what is the proportion of people released from prison in 2000 who returned to prison in 12 years? Okay, that's the first question. And then the second question is, what is the proportion of all people ever released from prison who currently live in society who return in 12 years? Ask yourself when you think about this, which question do you think you actually want the answer to? And I think the question you want to ask is the second one. And unfortunately, the first question is the one that the statistics answer. In other words, what we do is we follow one group of people who've been released, and we don't think about everybody. Yet we talk about when people use the top number. So the first number is 53%. The second number is 33%. In other words, Rhodes and his colleagues documented this very carefully. Look at those differences between those two numbers. 33% of the people who have ever been released from prison come back. 53% of the people who leave in any given year come back. Now, I'm not going to talk about the statistics behind this, but notice how big the difference is. With the majority are coming back. Wow, that sounds like everyone's failing, right? It sounds like Bret's not doing his job, and over there at Pennsylvania, the Department of Correction. However, when you realize that it's actually 33%, now that's still quite a bit of failure, but that means 2/3 of the people who exit prison never come back. And that's actually the number that answers the question we want to know, which is, to what degree do people who go to prison come back? And so I think this is really important to reset the conversation and focus on the fact that actually quite a few people succeed when they leave prison. So next slide. So many people do desist. So if we can acknowledge that, and instead of having the false conversation about everybody failing and nobody desisting, we can then start to move to a more constructive conversation. And I think there are 2 elements to that conversation. The first is, can we enhance the process for those currently desisting? Because there are people who are desisting. So the question is, can we support that process? Can we improve that process? And then, of course, there are some people that are not. And can we get more people on this pathway to desistance? Okay, so those are the 2 things that sort of motivate me going forward and drive the discussion in the paper. Next slide. So it's important to realize that in criminology, there are 2 basic models or theories of desistance that sort of compete with one another. One is indirect social control, and the other one is identity achievement. Indirect social control came first. It was first promoted as a theory in 1993, and has sort of been around for the longest. Identity achievement has only recently, in the last 10 or 15 years, reached more maturity, although in the most recent reviews, more important people think that this is the best representation of what's going on. But indirect social control says, look, the way people don't commit crime is they get social bonds that directly control their behavior. So their relationship with their wife or their partner, their job, it creates costs to continuing to commit crime. And over time, those costs become strong enough that you decide to avoid crime. So in that model, it's all about control. So direct control and indirect control are substitutes. Direct social control is more coercive and more costly, but they're both doing the same thing. They're instituting costs associated with actions. And so the current model of reentry and parole and probation is very consistent with this approach. We try to get people involved in jobs and other relationships. So they have indirect social control, but in lieu of that, they have direct social control. The alternative model, which again, I think has received a lot more attention and support recently in particular, is that people need to achieve pro-social identities as adults. And so what this is about fundamentally is reaching a point where you're not happy with where you are and moving to an adult pro-social identity. And that this identity achievement is key to desistance. You desist when you've achieved an adult identity that you yourself want. And that's not consistent with the current model of reentry. And so I want to talk about that inconsistency and think a little bit more about what identity achievement is and how that then can be translated into discussions about how to do reentry. Next slide. So ask yourself a simple question. Do people in prison have a full identity the way we think about identity for our children or for just generally when you talk about people achieving an adult identity? And when you look at the statistics, I think the answer is no. Most people exiting prison have not graduated from high school, held a full-time job, had a steady romantic partner, or had children. These aren't the only things that mark adult achievement or adult identity roles, but these are some of them. And you want to contrast that with what, if you go and interview people qualitatively and ask what they want when they're in prison, the vast majority of people want these adult roles. They want things like they want a steady partner. They want to be a provider. They want to be a parent. That's what they themselves want. And this is repeated over and over again. There are occasionally people that basically say, look, I'm going to go out and commit crime again. But the vast majority don't aspire to that. They would like a different path. So we have a situation where people haven't achieved an identity that they're happy with, but that they want. Next slide. So if you think about it that way, it's not fundamentally about reintegration, because the people that are there and re-entering haven't been integrated in the first place. So it's about integration. So in other words, it's about moving from a place where you don't have a place in society to a framework where you do. So that kind of discussion about moving from not having a place in adult society to one where you do, that's the discussion of human development by psychologists, which is a very well-studied field and well-understood area. It's well understood in terms of the processes. It's not necessarily well understood about how to do it all the time. And so if we start talking about human development, it becomes clear that it's not human redevelopment, right? It's just the process by which you become an adult and that you have identity roles that you yourselves want. So this process of development, next slide, is the same challenge that everyone has. I have 3 kids in college. They have no idea who they are right now. I hope they figure it out. But I don't see that the challenge that they're facing is that different than the challenge that we're talking about when we're talking about people who are re-entering from prison. I changed majors 7 times. Sorry, Dad. I didn't know what I wanted to do. I didn't really get on a forceful path until I was 28. Okay. So, I mean, I think this kind of churning and making choices and trying to figure out what you want to do. That's a process everyone has. And it's not just set aside for people in prison. So I think sometimes we think about the reentry process as if it's this completely distinctive process that only happens to people who went to prison. And I just don't think that's true. It's a challenge of human development that we all engage in. So next slide. But of course, when you talk about this, there are some issues about identity in prison that are different than, say, the identity challenges facing my children in college. For some, they have well-formed antisocial identities. I don't think that's the majority of folks in prison, but they do. There are some of that, and so there is some movement away from that. They have to decide they don't want that anymore and have to move to something else. And there's also a distinct possibility that people in prison can then form this adult antisocial identity. So, this is a common expression is graduate school for crime. So there's a concern that peers will sort of help people sort of learn how to be better criminals rather than the alternative. And so, I mean, there's good research showing that that's at least a possibility. Again, remember, not everybody returns, but in this process of bad identity achievement can also occur. So in terms of the policy options here, we want to be thoughtful in prison and subsequently that we're not supporting anti-social identity achievement, but instead supporting pro-social identity achievement. So that's the big question. And, particularly for practitioners, like, yeah, that sounds pretty obvious. Now, how do you do that? And that's a little bit harder. And I have to be honest, I don't think I solved the problem in the paper. I don't really even come that close to it. But I think it's useful to start thinking about the key features of an environment that would, in fact, start contribute to having a positive identity. Next slide. So the first thing I think is the first and foremost thing is the idea of respect. Jamie Fader and her grad student at Temple have written a very, very nice chapter that I would encourage you to read about the importance of respect in this environment. From my own personal experience, one of the most embarrassing moments of my professional career occurred when I was teaching a difficult statistics class at Maryland, where 40% of the students failed, and it was discouraging because they all needed to pass the class in order to move on. And about halfway through, I'd been teaching it 4 or 5 times, I got called into the department chair's office, and he pointed out that I had in the student responses, more students had said I was disrespectful to them as people than had said that about any other teacher in the entire department. In other words, I got more no respect hits than every other faculty combined, which was a deeply embarrassing and troubling comment that I apparently was taking these students that were in this challenging environment and I wasn't showing them respect, and it was affecting their learning ability. So I went off to the teaching center and said, how do I fix this? And they said, learn everyone's name. Well, there were 200 students in the class, so I learned everybody's name. So the next semester I learned everybody's name. And it was remarkable what happened. My teaching evaluations went up by a full point on a 5-point scale. But more importantly, I enjoyed the class more, and students actually learned better. They did better. We had better performance. And I think it's important that, even though, yes, we know some people are going to fail, like my failure rate wasn't that different than the failure rate for people in prison, it gets discouraging. However, if the goal is to move people to a different place, you have to respect them as people as having the potential to do that. And one of the neat things is I saw students who had failed my class once come back and become wildly successful, including going off to Duke and becoming a law professor. So I think it's important that respect form the foundation for how we think about this. And it's not hard to realize that if you're not being respected as a person, you're probably not going to want to achieve the things that the person who's not respecting you is telling you to achieve. The next thing I think is fundamental here is a sense of choice. We like to think about reentry, a lot of mandates. You have to do this, and you have to do this, and you have to do that. But that's not how identity achievement works. It's fundamentally about choice. And in fact, the psychologists say that if you have an identity that you haven't chose, you don't really have a fully formed identity. You just fell into it. And so I think it's important to understand that we have to create an environment where people are allowed to make choices. That means they may not make the choice you want to make all the time, and you're allowed to incentivize choices that seem better for folks. However, in the end, it is about choice. And agency is an important component of this phenomenon. So in that context, it's also important to notice that when you follow people's choices and you see what they did, you can actually see who's on the path to a positive identity achievement. You don't need a risk tool that focuses on the crimes they did 5 years ago. You just need to see what they're doing now. Because we know people who successfully complete programs and other things like that do better than everyone else, substantially, 20 to 40% better, even if the program itself is not particularly effective. In other words, we learn about the people who participate in these programs by allowing them the choice to participate and succeed. The third thing I think is that I think it's important to create an environment where learning is the key idea, because learning itself, someone who's a learner has an identity, even if they're in prison or in a situation where they don't have a job necessarily. But if you're a learner, that is an identity. That becomes a way of thinking about yourself different than I'm a criminal or other things. And learning is also important because fundamentally, if you think about the challenge of development, it's about learning. I learned I didn't want to be an actuary by being an actuary. And then think about, well, what did I like about being an actuary? What did I not like about being an actuary? I dated one person. I decided, what did I learn about that? I'd like to date a different person. So you learn things, and that's how you make your choices. And the second thing about learning is that it's a like I said, fundamental to the process. So I think if you create a learning environment, you create an environment where people actually have an identity to begin with. They're a learner, and they're doing the very thing that needs to happen for development. And then finally, I think it's important to stress the value of relationships. I've had the privilege over the course of the years I've been in studying this topic to listen to the story of many people who have the lived experience of incarceration. And almost to a person, the story involves a relationship that they had with someone either inside or outside of the prison system, where that person believed in them and loved them in a sense. It's not always romantic love. It can be lots of other kinds of love, but really believed in them and gave them a positive relationship. And I think it's hard to overstate the importance of that, particularly in an environment where maybe many folks haven't had the benefit of those kinds of relationships. And since I think fundamentally, if you think about people that have a well-formed, positive pro-social identity, the ability to have relationships with others are a key element to that. So if you haven't had that experience, how are you going to have an identity role that is founded on having good relationships if you haven't had that? And so I think both from the perspective of the kinds of support and help that allows that to happen, as well as the things you're trying to model, I think the ability to have positive relationships with other people is an important component of any reentry process moving forward. So next slide. So there's some other things I think we don't need. And I think the first thing we need is we don't need long-term supervision. It's hard to imagine a model in the current environment where we won't have some control. But right now in Pennsylvania and other places, it's not uncommon for parole or probation to last for many, many years. And it's fundamentally, from a perspective of looking at the desistance patterns that occur, not helpful and in some cases counterproductive. If you think about it, many times we give long-term supervision periods to people that are very high risk. Yet the highest risk people are going to fail the fastest. And if you observe the high-risk people that have survived for 2 years without reoffending or going back to prison, the reality is they're not high risk anymore, because if they'd been high risk, they'd have failed. So I don't think we need long-term periods of supervision. I think we need 1 or 2 years of supervision if we're going to have a model of some control, and then end it, because then it's not helping anymore and it's just punitive. The last thing is that there's barriers to opportunities. You know, if you're into control, you think, well, the person needs a job, so in order to have indirect social control. But you also say, well, gee, you know, we don't want to provide them with opportunities where they can commit crime. So you want to restrict their opportunities because there is this sense of control. However, in the context of saying, look, they're doing the same human achievement that everyone else is, well, then they need to be able to have access to the same roles that everyone else. Maybe not every single role and every single opportunity, but you can't, if you define the goal as adult achievement of adult identity achievement, and then you take off from the table many of the simple opportunities and roles that would allow them to achieve that identity, then you're working against yourself. And I've written in other places where I think these barriers actually are counterproductive on other dimensions as well. Next slide. So, what I've tried to put forward in this document, and again, I'm sure it's frustrating to practitioners because I haven't provided a lot of concrete detail, but at least I've tried to create a vision for reentry where I recognize that the key goal here is to help people achieve pro-social identities that they themselves want. We're not imposing something else on folks. Most of the folks in prison want the same thing most everyone else does. And so when you view it that way, desistance, not committing any more crimes, is a side effect of sexual identity achievement. It's not the thing you're trying to do. You try to achieve identity achievement, and since these identities are inconsistent with committing crime, people will move forward. I mean, if you think about it, the reason why you didn't commit a crime today is not because you were going to get caught. It's because it's not consistent with how you think about yourself as a person. So then you have to, if you think that's the idea, then you do need to create concrete environments that support pro-social identity development. In other words, the things that people experience when they're going through the process of reentry have to be consistent with the theory that says people are desisting because they've achieved positive identities. Okay, so next slide. So quick summary of things that you should take away from this talk. First thing is prison is not a revolving door. The statistics that people cite are not appropriate for the discussion that we're having about reentry. They're appropriate for some things. If you're a prison warden, I think that the numbers are important to discuss, but that's not what we're talking about. We were talking about what's the failure rate for anyone who's ever been to prison, and those numbers are much lower than the number of who's going to fail, for people that are getting released today. And they're much lower, in fact. Second is we need to recognize desistance as a developmental problem rather than a control problem. And then finally, I think the focus has to be on identity achievement rather than control. You don't allow people to achieve a functioning identity as an adult by controlling them there. You have to allow them to be human, which is to make choices and move to something that, but remember, in most cases, people want a pro-social identity rather than an antisocial one. So I want to thank you for your attention. I'm very much looking forward to the comments of the discussants. It's exciting to see Maryland represented. I was a faculty member there till 2006. In fact, I knew Bret as a student, who was a fantastic student, and he's gone on and done wonderful, amazing things. He's the ideal of what you want a PhD student to do. He's had a real impact. And I've seen Julio in many different situations, and I'm very much looking forward to his comments as well. So thanks so much for your attention, and I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Terrific. Thank you, Shawn. That's a whole lot for us to consider, and to help us consider it, we want to draw in our other panel members. And so we're going to give each one of them, Rashawn, Bret, and Julio, a few minutes, 5 minutes, to give us their high-level reactions. And then I'm going to try to thread some of that back together into a panel discussion. So go ahead, Rashawn.
All right, Brent, thank you. Shawn, that was a great presentation. It was nice to hear that. I definitely want to thank AEI for the invitation. As people know, based on what Shawn just presented, he's one of the leading experts on this topic, and he nailed it with this paper. It's balanced and noteworthy. I mean, as I was reflecting on it, I couldn't help, even as a researcher that aims to be balanced and think about the work that I do and not bring in the personal, I couldn't help but to think about my own friends who fall into these different buckets that Shawn was describing. I obviously think about the dire statistics, particularly for Black males, when we think about the criminal justice system and how we are thinking about what does it mean to enter society, which I think is important. There were two huge kind of quotes that stood out to me. I mean, there were several, but I'll mention two for the sake of time. One was where Shawn said, quote, he wrote, I asserted, talking about a book review that he'd done some years ago, I asserted that prison reentry is a misnomer because the problem facing those returning to civilian life from prison is fundamentally one of entry rather than reentry. When focusing on reentry, one thinks the problem is people needing to reacquire the jobs and housing that prison took away. That was a valuable statement, very, very powerful. Because the point is that most people who are going to prison do not have these things. Most people who are engaging in crime aren't just doing it for the sake of doing crime or because they have some sort of biological or genetic deficit, but because certain types of opportunities and social networking connections have not been there. So how do we increase commitment to a new career identity? As a sociologist who specializes in social psychology, I always get excited when we talk about identity. And in responding to that question, increasing commitment, Shawn lays out several things. One in particular, where he said, quote, people whose past criminal careers identify them as high risk should not be subjected to excessively long wait periods before they are given the chance to engage with society. Not only is that about being on probation, but my interpretation of that is also about when people are incarcerated. How can we ensure that we create programs that help people to increase their adult roles, particularly as it relates to education and jobs? I mean, the other part about relationships, I think sometimes maybe people can figure some of those things out even from prison. But when it comes to education and jobs, these are things that we could do a much better job, no pun intended, of helping people to be able to do. I also want to help frame some of the entry rather than re-entry and integration rather than reintegration frameworks that Shawn laid out. I grew up in Atlanta, and I'm originally from Tennessee, but in growing up in Atlanta, I was zoned for a high school that didn't have enough books for all the students, that the bathrooms did not work, where teachers were so overwhelmed with the lack of resources that it wasn't about kids deflecting or removing away from education. It was that education told them long ago that they were not worthy enough of even having a decent space. We have to think in Atlanta, this was in the 80s. You could think about how hot it was in the summer. And the school that I was on for did not have air conditioning. We know research documents that if you're learning in a hot environment, that your standardized test scores go down. There are a series of things that I'm aiming to highlight about structure and a lack of these resources that these individuals had opportunities, that they had a lack of opportunities for, a lack of jobs were available. And Shawn made a good point about having buffers later in life. I think about how my mother was able to put me in a busing program where she connected with my fourth grade teacher. And that's part of the reason why I'm here today. And I oftentimes think about if I didn't get in that program, if I didn't have certain opportunities, that I would have had that same reaction that other students and some of my friends actually had about education and work opportunities. Accordingly, respect is a fundamentally big deal. It goes two ways. It's not only about people respecting the system, but it's also about supposedly the system respecting them as human beings. And I think those are some of the things that we can work on. At the same time, as a person who studies how structure matters, we cannot discount the importance of individual agency, as Shawn noted. Individual agency is key. And at a certain point in time, while we might look at a 13-year-old or 15-year-old, maybe even a 21-year-old, it's mentioning thinking about people in college. And of course, I'm super excited to have so many Terps represented on this panel, and thinking about how yesterday was the last day of classes at the University of Maryland for many of my students who are around 21-year-olds. We can think about the role of individual agency in these buffers. And so what I like to think about are models of success, like Marcus Bullock, who owns and operates Flick Shop, an amazing example. And I'll mention two quick things as I close. First is that part of what happens in these communities that I'm describing all across America, not just in predominantly Black or Latino neighborhoods, but also in predominantly white rural neighborhoods, is what I call the brain drain. It's where some of the most talented, some of the most successful, some of the most well-resourced are plucked away, never to really return, because the things they need to actually return and be successful in those neighborhoods simply don't exist. The people who are there are left behind. On the other hand, we also can think about the importance of individual agency and how we might instill motivation for garnering these adult roles. And I think that part of it is a mentoring model that we might think about how putting individuals in the lives of others who need to be positive, academic. That doesn't mean that they have PhDs. It simply means that they value education and understanding the importance of getting a trade. So they have to be positive, they have to be academic, they have to be visible, and they have to be accessible. See, part of what happens with the brain drain is that it cuts off people from being visible and accessible in the communities where they're from. Outside of going to visit my grandmother, oftentimes I don't spend time in my hometowns where I grew up at. And that's unfortunate. And that's the case for some of my other friends who were successful as well. So I'll stop there, but really good paper, Shawn. I look forward to other people's insights.
Terrific. Thank you, Rashawn. You really great comments. And I particularly appreciated the notion of respect being two-way and that systems matter. It isn't enough just to load all this responsibility onto the shoulders of individuals who are already under-resourced. We have to think about the systems that surround them. Okay, so we're going to move on now to Bret and hear what his reflections were.
Great, thanks. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks to AEI for putting this panel together, this great panel, and I want to especially thank Shawn for this fantastic paper. I have to say it's always intimidating critiquing Shawn's work, and there's very little to really disagree with here. And I also want to say Shawn's moment of vulnerability about 40% failing. I don't think I was in the 40% failing, but I always felt respected by Shawn at University of Maryland. And darn it, he was always right. He was hard, and he was a strict critique of our work, but I found his work to be highly important, and he was always usually right in the critiques he gave us as a professor. So it's a huge privilege to be able to comment. And I have a number of comments across 6 different points that Shawn made in his paper. I'm going to keep it really brief, though, just so that we can have enough time for a back and forth discussion. I think the first thing that I thought was really important about Shawn's paper was the connection between theory and policy. And I was recently on the NIJ panel on desistance that Shawn mentioned. And one of the, I think, frustrating things for us who are in the policymaking realm is that there's this whole academic exercise that talks about desistance. And I can tell you that most of my colleagues at the Department of Corrections and most of the politicians in Pennsylvania have never even heard the word desistance, much less be able to define it. And so I think Shawn does us a favor here by really bringing it down to a practical level and trying to connect what has really traditionally been a very academic exercise in theory, and tying that into some concrete policy scenarios, and what it means practically for policymakers. I think he's right that theory is important. I think conversely, most policymakers are working on an assumed theory in what they're doing in practice. They just might not know or explicitly state what the propositions of that theory are. And so it really takes two-way translation. Translational criminology has often been referred for, to be able to understand what policymakers are looking at, because they are indeed, in fact, in the business of helping people transform their lives. But also understand the theory and the academic part of that. So I appreciated that part of Shawn's paper. I was intrigued by his discussion about pro-social identity transformation, and that really seems to have the most empirical support as a model of desistance. I would tend to agree in my reading of the literature that seems to kind of be winning in terms of empirical support. But I would also push a little bit and then say I'm not ready to throw out indirect social controls quite yet. I think on my on-the-ground experience in Pennsylvania with some programs like the Hawaii Hope Probation Program, which is essentially a deterrence-based program that provides clear expectations for probationers, holds them to those expectations, and responds in a quick, consistent, swift way for violations of those the rules. Has shown in some experimental research to be effective. And indeed, I think that there is still some hope for what Shawn referred to as indirect social controls as mechanisms to, what we call on the inside, help people fake it till they make it. So sometimes they're not going through an identity transformation, but they're just kind of faking it in order to get by in the system, to the point where they eventually maybe internalize it because they faked it for so long that then it becomes real and it does become an identity transformation. Sometimes they may never even get to that identity transformation. They just have changed their behavior. And I think at the end of the day, from a public standpoint, that's really all we're asking for, is that, people change their behavior when it comes to crime, that they abide by the law, even if they haven't internalized that change. So I don't want to throw out indirect social controls, but I do agree that pro-social identity transformation seems to have a lot of empirical support and would be an important mechanism. On this idea about desistance as a process versus a discrete change, I thought it was interesting, the analogy that Shawn made in his paper to being cured from a disease like cancer, and as opposed to how a lot of people who are working in desistance literature think about this process of desistance. And so I thought that was really interesting. I also very much agree with Shawn that long probation or long supervision tails are ineffective, especially when they're driven by risk assessment. What we've seen in our research in Pennsylvania is that because these risk assessment models, what happens is that we'll use a risk assessment tool, an actuarial tool, and we'll assess someone as their probability of reoffending and set supervision levels or supervision terms based on that. And there's a certain degree of error, sometimes a big degree of error, a large degree of error in those probabilistic models. And we've seen people on supervision for 3, 4, or 5 years who haven't even had as much as a technical parole violation for a minor violation. And yet they're being maintained on higher levels of supervision because on this actuarial assessment based on their past criminal history, they're coming out as high risk. And so it's not really based on their current behavior, their demonstrated behavior, which I think is what it should be based on, is their actual demonstrated behavior, not a risk assessment. So I very much agree with Shawn's point there. In terms of whether desistance is a process versus a discrete change, I think we do see desistance as a process in some of our research in Pennsylvania. We're working on currently on a recidivism report that confirms a lot of Shawn's statistics about not everybody failing, that the recidivism rates aren't as high as we might think. If we look at just people released from prison in a year, as Shawn mentioned, they are quite high after 15 years, about 70 to 80% recidivate. But if we look at things like deceleration, so slowing down the rate of offending, even if still offending, but slowing at a slower rate, or de-escalation, looking at reducing the severity of the types of crimes that are committed, we see that conversely about 90% meet some benchmark of desistance. So that's 9 out of 10. That's most people are meeting some form of desistance. But those things like deceleration and de-escalation are processes that happen over time. Signaling was another part of Shawn's paper that he didn't go much into in his overview, but I also think is a worthy concept. And Shawn mentions in the paper that he's not bothered by the fact that programs may serve only as a signal to identify those who've changed, even if ineffective. And I would also agree with that. I'd share that view. That I'm not bothered at all if we have programs that only serve one purpose in the Department of Corrections, to identify people as a signal. I think that's actually probably more realistic too, because a lot of the program evaluation, which I also recently reviewed for this NIJ paper on desistance, is pretty abysmal on the effectiveness of a lot of these programs. And in fact, AEI hosted a panel I was reminded of about 15 years ago by David Farabee on his book called Rethinking Rehabilitation, which pointed out a lot of this in terms of the pretty abysmal literature on outcomes in prison programming and criminal justice programming. So I think, programming, there's a lot of ineffective programs out there, and if it can only serve as a signal to identify those who have changed their identity, I think that's useful enough. And I also think policymakers like parole board members would go along with this as well. I think it would be hard for them to admit, but a lot of times they're prescribing programs just to kind of cover their butt politically, but they're not so concerned if the program actually works. They want to be able to say, if someone fails, I prescribed that program. And so I think if you could get them to be honest, they would probably not be so concerned if the program just was a signal and didn't have any causal effect or on an outcome. And lastly, I thought the discussion about agency was really important in Shawn's paper. I agree that it would be ideal to create a prison environment that enables people to seek to be able to form a pro-social identity. I think that's really difficult in a prison environment because it is such an artificial environment. For instance, I think part of learning, which was one of Shawn's 3 things, learning, respect, and relationships. Learning can't happen if people can't fail. And in prison, we have an environment where people are often, it's so artificial. People are told when to get up, when to eat, when to go where. And they're punished for failure, for misconducts. And so there's little room for failure, which means that hampers a learning environment. I don't have the answer, but I think it is important, and it's just extremely challenging within a prison environment. we are doing some things in Pennsylvania that would meet his objectives of learning, respect, relationships. We're supporting college courses for our population based on Pell funding now. We're also we have a robust visitation program where family members and friends can come in and visit and support a lot of volunteers coming into our facility, which I think is important to Rashawn's point about mentoring, trying to really open the doors to prison and have the community come in as much as possible to meet people while they're in prison. And then agency. I think one thing that we're looking at is just helping people to build their agency by being able to make their own choices while in prison. For instance, being able to choose who they cell with, who their cellmate is, security concerns aside, being able to choose what prison they go to. In Pennsylvania, they all come to one central prison first to get diagnosed, and then they are farmed out to 23 prisons around the state. And maybe we can give them a choice on, what prison to go to, and building and allowing that choice helps to build that sense of agency, which can help in that progression towards building a pro-social identity. So there's a lot more. I'm going to stop there, but again, fantastic paper, Shawn. Thanks for allowing me to comment on it, and looking forward to the Q&A.
Thanks, Bret. Again, terrific. And I want us to come back to the signaling question, which I think is really important. And so we'll hold on that. But next is Julio Medina, and I'm sure will have some insights based on his own life and on his work to help us, to tell us and try to enlighten us as to what this sounds like from the standpoint of system impacted individuals.
So thank you all. Thank you, Shawn, for your research, for your paper. Definitely spoke volumes. I'm gonna jump around a little bit. Loved what I heard, but I think kind of as we begin and we think about this, I think it all starts with humanizing language, right? We're not ex-prisoners, we're not ex-cons, we're not parolee, we're not any of that, right? We're people, we're fathers, we're mothers, we're aunts, we're uncles, and that begins the humanizing process, because for so long, some people that are going through that system have become a number, right? We've been stripped of identity. We've been stripped, you get a haircut, they take your clothes, they shave you bald, at least in New York State, and you go through this kind of reorientation process that you are now a prisoner. So I think it's important as we think about this conversation that we really think about humanizing language, just as a starting point. And Shawn, I think I just disagree with one thing when you said, what people want in prison. Priority is freedom. I know you said a couple other things, but the priority is freedom. And I say that as a justice impacted person. I served 12 years in prison. And during those 12 years, as I was reading the paper, so many things rang true, and I want to just jump around a little bit, but when you talked about some of the programming, and sometimes for the first time that allows someone, right, who begins to develop some agency to see themselves in a different light. So I'm out of New York City, South Bronx, poorest economic area in the country in the 80s, and just an explanation, not an excuse for crimes. And I was sentenced to time in prison for drug distribution, and all that time, that's who I thought I was. I mean, I was other things, but when we think about kind of this identity achievement, at that point, I'm thinking, oh shit, this is the person that I've become. And I was in a class, and I was told to describe myself in this class. And I never forget this, because I'm sitting there, I'm like, all right, I look at communities, I'm bilingual, I try to be safe, I go in, I try to take over a block and another one, I go to different states, and I kind of canvass the area. And the professor said, wow, so Julio, you sound like a community organizer. So for the first time, I wasn't identified as a drug. Someone else identified me differently. And that was that moment when it was like, oh, wait a minute, what's that? First of all, I had to go look it up, right? I didn't know what a community organizer was. So, I tried to figure out, okay, if that's me, that's what I want to become. And I think that just was a crucial point when we think about some of the programming that happens for some of us, again, who are in that space. And I got to tell you, in this course, I remember this was, I was going to a parole board. And I think, Brett, I think you said it, fake it till you make it. So I'm going to this parole board and I'm like, you know what? This program is going to look good. So let me make sure I got that as I go in. And as I went through this program and I heard that, and my identity began to change, I had a life sentence on the back. And, at that moment, it was like, and you talked about that distance that kind of just happens. And it was that moment where I said, I am somebody else. I can do something different with my life. And it wasn't, there were some gradual things that brought me to that space, but I just remember that in particular and how that was just one of those defining moments that allowed me to say, you know what? It's no longer about me making the parole board, Brett. It's no longer about me faking it till I make it. I think I found something here and I want to hold on to it and I want to explore it. So that was just some of the stuff as I was reading that popped out. I'm still trying to figure out, and again, I'm not a researcher, so forgive some of my ignorance when it comes to research. But I'm trying to put together the college and the prison experience and kind of that release and kind of all of us trying to find the same things. Prison, we've been crippled from the beginning, right? From lack of resources. Many of us come from the poorest neighborhoods in the community. In New York City, at one point, we came from 85% of the prison population came from the 7 poorest neighborhoods in New York City. So, if we have to talk about poverty, we have to be able to talk about, in those 7 communities, right? 85% of people are Black and brown people. We have to talk about race as we think about, kind of this identity change and that it felt as though, and not an excuse, just an explanation. From that point, the disadvantage was very clear. Rashawn, I think you said it when you talked about our school system versus other school systems. So the deck seemed stacked against us very early in life. And again, no excuse. Shawn, you came and did your thing. My route sadly was prison. But I just thought that as I was reading that, I think one of the things when we think about, identity changes is that one time that just jolted me into the reality that I fully agree with when I was called something other than what I was in prison for. But as we think about this, I just want to say, it's these risk scores sometimes, and I'm agreeing with, in New York, we have something called COMPAS. And this COMPAS is correctional offender management profiling for alternative sanctions. Yeah, say that, right? 3 times. Everything about that feels wrong. It's not culturally competent. It's not taking, all it's looking at is a criminogenic profile, which you clearly express, which I love when you're expressing those pieces in your paper, because it talks about how skewed this is, and it's based on this deficit model, right? It's based on kind of every deficit someone may have and saying, okay, here we are, and these are the programs we will wrap around you when you have no agency in this process. You have no commitment to this process of change because it's being told this is what you have, and which goes back to the whole respect thing that you talked about that just lacks in the prison system, right? And in prison which is crazy. We have the most respect for each other you can possibly imagine. You reach over someone's plate, you gotta say, "Excuse me, brother, can I reach for this?" Or "Excuse me, can I?" There's a lot of respect, and I think that's what breeds some of the success that we see when some of us are released and some of us are doing different things with our lives. I love kind of how you reverse the stats around recidivism. I mean, that's important to look at because, we always talk about, who's going back. It's not talking about the successes. It doesn't talk about the hundreds that I know in New York who who are doing this work. I manage an organization called Exodus. We service about 4,000 people a year walk through our doors. I have a trauma center. I have a wellness center. I have 248 staff, and of those 248 staff, 90% have been impacted by the justice system. Who better than us to create a roadmap for others? So I think it's important that, and there's others, there's a bunch of others. I don't want to just, because I run that shop. There's just so many bunch of other organizations that we can highlight that are really doing the work. But sadly, we have to sensationalize recidivism. That's usually the norm in our country. And that becomes a sad reality because now we scare folk into, yes, harshest prison sentences. Meanwhile, people are doing really, really well, and actually recidivism rates are lower. I want to end with these two things. I know we don't have a lot of time, Brent, but I just want to say thank you. But, when we talk about education, I think, and we know, 70% of the folk going in the population don't have a GED, don't have a high school diploma. Same percentages that of people of color. We as a country have to look at this, right? I mean, if we were any other place, that's a system that will be torn down and rebuilt, right? When you're talking about, failures at 35, 40%, that's a system that should not exist if failures, especially failures of that magnitude. So something has happened in corrections that we should look at. There's a model in Switzerland, right? That Switzerland model. And I just remember this part of it that always stuck out for me. The correction officer says somebody went back. The correction officer stops and said, "Oh my God, what did I do wrong?" And that is something that's so compelling. When the onus of the responsibility goes on that person, that he feels, "Oh my God, he's back. That means something I did wrong, that he came back here." And I think that kind of begins to change the tables of some of the work that we're doing and we're identifying. And again, Shawn, so grateful for what you're doing, bringing this to the forefront. Just means so much and allows so many others to do this work in a very different way. So thank you for the opportunity to share with you this afternoon.
Okay, so we've got a couple questions coming in. I've got some questions, but I first want to give Shawn a chance. If there's anything in what you heard in the comments that you wanted to respond to, we should probably do that first, and then I've got some questions that I'd like to follow up on. You're still on mute, Shawn.
How many PhDs does it take to press an unmute button? First, I want to apologize to Brent for being a little longer than I had planned. I don't know what happened. I practiced it, but hopefully we still can do what you need to do. Second thing, I need to apologize to my children who are apparently listening. I do think you can have positive identities. I'm fully faithful. I have a lot of confidence in you. So that's the. But in terms of the comments, I mean, I think, particularly with respect to, like, when you talk to people who are exiting prison, I mean, yes, they want to be free. The question is, what do they want to be when they're free? And it's overwhelming that they don't want to go out and commit more crime. That's the part I'm trying to stress, is that it's yes, they want to be free, but then it isn't as if these people are saying the first thing I want to do when I go out is commit a crime. That's not the goal. And I think that's important. And I think, I think the comment that Brett made about that there being a role for control. Yes, I think that's true. Like, why did you drive 70 miles an hour in the 65-mile-an-hour zone and not 80 on the way to work today? Well, because you didn't want to get caught. So there's plenty of reasons why we do. There are places in our lives where we do respond to incentives, and that's okay. I'm not saying that that's not true. But I'm saying that fundamentally, in terms of how you spend your time and how you live, there's going to be there's a place for understanding that in the end, this isn't just about, I don't do it because the cost is too high. I don't do it because it's not consistent with who I am as a person. And I think that's a distinction that's important. So it's not to say that people aren't rational and they don't respond to incentives. They do. And we should remember that. I also think that in the context of some of the comments, that if you make it about integration, then you do, rather than reintegration or reentry, then you'd have to acknowledge the very things that Julio mentioned, i.e., that there are a lot of people, particularly in certain communities, that haven't had the opportunities that other people have. And so that's, I think, really important. Like, it immediately makes it obvious that there's a lot of people who haven't had the same opportunities and therefore haven't achieved these things, not because they didn't want them, but because they didn't have those opportunities. And so I think if you make it all about reentry and reintegration, you act as if everybody was fully integrated and ready to go before they went to prison, and that it's all about prison. Well, actually, that's not true. And the sociologist, right? Rashawn is a sociologist. He knows this isn't true. I mean, the examples he gave in his life or personal life but I mean, that's what sociology teaches us, is that there's very deep structural differences in opportunity in this country. And those opportunities writ large are human development opportunities. They're opportunities to become the adult that you might want to be. And it's pretty clear that it's not as if across racial groups or that the aspirations are very different. People want to have these adult roles, and so and they may define them slightly differently in different contexts, but in general, these are roles that all humans want. They want to be self-sufficient. They want to be have partners. They want to have families. They want to be part of the communities. And so I think that that's the, that I think this framework actually makes those points more obvious rather than less, and should start to ask questions about not just about prison. It gets because there's a lot of problems before the person showed up at prison, and those problems don't fall on the correctional system. Those problems fall on the processes that we created that didn't provide people with those opportunities to develop as a human. And I think, if you just looking at, the experiences, I live in a place that's near Schenectady, where the two high schools for Schenectady versus the town next door are about 3 miles apart, but the opportunities presented to the people that go to one school versus another are worlds apart. And I think it makes it clear that it's not just about individuals' own achievements and effort. And I hope this discussion sort of makes that point in a way that I don't think reentry or reintegration does.
Yeah, and I want to, the point of this conversation that really stood out to me in listening to all of you was around this issue of agency/identity, or identity/agency, right? Our agency grows out of that sense of who we are. So I'm really curious on a couple different points. I mean, when I think about this issue, and I imagine Julio Medina as this sweet little baby just born, mom holding him in his arms. She never in her million years was imagining that, this was the future for her son, that, this one's for prison. We've got, there was a process by which Julio was directed toward prison. There was a life course that I think that sometimes if we could see the lives of people in prison all at once, we wouldn't ask, how did you get here? We would ask, what took you so long? There's just so many things that have contributed to this and really eroded or preempted or distorted this sense of identity and agency. It created a false identity, and part of that identity was a sense that I don't have control. Then we take people and we put them in prison, and we put that lack of agency on steroids, and then they get to the end of their sentence and they're pushed back out of the system, and we're surprised that nothing has changed, when in fact most things have been reinforced in that experience. So all of this is to lead up to, we have this idea that people, many people, if Shawn's numbers are correct, we have this idea that there's a substantial number of people who are already on a desistance pathway, and there may be others, and we're not identifying them. And then we've got a bunch of other people who may be at some point on moving toward that, and we don't know who they are. So I open this to everybody on the panel to comment on how do we find people who are in that process and are ready to engage in a different future. And anybody can pick up, and if you've got a thought, weigh in.
I mean, I think, in the paper, Shawn did a good job of laying out a theoretical model about how we think about the highs and lows of this motivation. I mean, I tend to think that a lot of that motivation comes from what we see, about what we see as possible. And so, as Julio was saying, and I think Brett mentioned it as well, we have to think about getting certain people into prisons. I think we have to think about what that access looks like. I tend to think, maybe not a surprise to a couple people, considering that I do a lot of social science tech work, that we can really utilize virtual reality to show people what a different world looks like, about what they can be, about what they can succeed to be. Because oftentimes what happens, what I notice about people in the impoverished communities, particularly people who've been incarcerated or even in and out of prisons, is that they oftentimes can't really see what a better life might be. I mean, we know that some people's lives are so downtrodden that they're trying to get a warm meal, trying to have a place to lay their head, become so normative for them from prison. So how do we show them a different life? And I think part of what that means is they're going oftentimes back to communities that are so marginalized, that are so downtrodden, trying to find a group of people who have full-time jobs with benefits is something that they don't readily see. But they do see people who have money, who are engaging in other types of endeavors that oftentimes might be criminal in nature. So we have to make that shift in terms of showing them the same way that we show kids. This gets back to Shawn's great point about how we have to think about entry and not reentry. See, if we think about entry and we think that individuals are lacking certain adult roles, and it's not to say that they're children. I mean, you might have a 25, 30, 40-year-old. They're clearly adults, but that doesn't mean that they've had that adult socialization that we expect to have happened. So then how do we give them that? If we call it re-entry, we're suggesting that they've already had it and they're just going to be able to go back out and succeed. That's not how it happens. If we start with entry, now all of a sudden we have something different, and we can start at a different point, a much earlier point in the process, to give them what they need to hopefully set them up in situations where not only they say, here are opportunities of success, I think I can do that, but also then that I think I can do that is the motivation that we're looking for. And I think because of whether that be particularly with men, with males, with young men, there's a certain masculine bravado that seems to cloud that these people are quite vulnerable, that they are quite scared, that they're quite afraid of what society is doing. And instead, oftentimes we're programmed because they're returning citizens, because they're ex-cons, we've been trained to fear them instead of realizing that really they fear society. And they fear society because they've never seen what they think success looks like. They've never seen anyone like them, anyone from where they're from that's successful. And what I found is that switch, on a personal level, I recognize it as a 40-year-old at this point, over 40-year-old at this point, that I'm not as relatable to an 18-year-old who might be involved with the criminal justice system as I was 20 years ago or 10 years ago. But I do know several people who are. And so part of that becomes how we structure people's opportunities in and outside of prison. And as Shawn is saying, take away some of those longer probation sentences, but start much earlier in prison about not necessarily rehabilitation, but entry. And I think that theoretical shift changes how we think about approaching people who are incarcerated.
So I'm curious for Bret. Yeah, I'm glad you turned your mic on. What does it look like from an administrator's standpoint in terms of trying to figure out, who might be approaching a decision point like Julio experienced? Like there's some process going on inside them that it's hard. You can't observe it. There's no X-ray here to look inside and tell what's going on. So what do you think of that question? What can corrections do better or differently in that?
Yeah, I think we're doing it wrong. I think we are trying to do it how you're describing, which is trying to get inside people's heads, basically. The prevalent framework within corrections is called the risk needs responsivity model. Shawn knows it, I know. To me, it's problematic because it's trying to figure out what's in people's heads rather than looking at their actual behavior. And as I referred to in my comments, I think you should believe people when they show you their behavior. And so whether you have behavioral benchmarks of you're clean for X period of time, and then we can reduce supervision or take off some form of whatever, I think, focusing on actual behavioral benchmarks is much more useful than trying to figure out where people are inside. I also think that the signaling approach is valuable, although I would say, and maybe Shawn can talk more about what makes a good signal, because I'm not remembering all of the components of what makes a good signal, but I do remember the one thing that Shawn mentioned that makes a good signal is that it is voluntary. And so when we look at participation in, say, in prison programming as a signal for someone who has desisted, the problem is technically in Pennsylvania, all of our programs are technically voluntary, but the parole board is not going to parole you unless you take it. So is it really voluntary when someone knows that they're not going to get paroled if they don't take this program? So even though it's technically voluntary, it's strictly required by the parole board in order to get a positive paroling action. So I see that as problematic I'd be curious to hear Shawn's response on that from a signaling standpoint. But I do think there's value in this signaling approach.
So I want before Shawn jumps in and gives a response there, I did want to hear Julio on this question as well. When you're working with men and women in the New York system, what are you looking for in terms of capacity? People who might make good participants for Exodus's program. I know that you're not trying to exclude anyone, but what do you think makes for a successful participant?
And let me just briefly just comment. I think it was Rashawn or someone who said something, because we had, Brent, a participant when we were talking about agency, somebody who came through our doors and he went through our workshops, and now he's with our job developers, and the job developer, finds him a job, and he comes back and he's like, yo, man, and he's not excited. He's more like shocked. And he says, this 9, I got a job, but it's crazy. It's 5 days a week, 9 to 5. And the shock of that for him, and so he never saw anyone in his immediate circle going to work, right? He it just says so much about that. He did not know that was the parameters of a full-time job. So it just rang so true when I heard some of the comments that were being made. For us, as you know, Brent, we take everybody who walks through our doors. I think one of the things that we look for is we have something called, we'll get a better name for, it's kind of this track 2, which should be track 1. But basically what we see is long-termers. So we have a lot of long-termers who come through our doors. And and I'm talking about, 37 years. I got someone on staff who's done 37 years. And we are his first job. So for us, it's understanding, and the staff understanding, and the team understanding when we're looking at participants, from 17 years old to for the next 37 years, he knows prison. This is what he's done, and in there, and then how he did his bid, right? Did he go to school? Did he do anything? Did he stay in the yard? So we look at all those things. I get referrals from people inside still. Hey, somebody's getting out. Check this person out. They went to school. They did some college. They might be good in this role. So for us, our doors are pretty wide open because, again, we know the lights can come on during one of the workshops. We know that they can look at one of our staff people who are credible messengers and they see them now in a suit, and they like, wait a minute, I was in the yard with you. We were in SHU in the box together, and now you're in a suit, and I'm looking at that, and the lights come on for this person. And now they want to figure out, hey, what's the formula here? What's happening here? So we've created a cadre of people that kind of model what success looks like for others. And again, there's we trip over ourselves all the time. Don't get me wrong, but it's been working thus far. I think that model has been working thus far in some of the work that we're doing.
Terrific. Okay, Shawn, do you want to come back on any of that?
I mean, I think I'm always struck when we have these conversations that the focus immediately becomes not about prison, but the situations before prison. And that speaks to the question that I raised, that this is a human development issue. And we would do a lot better to place this in this perspective of what are we doing to help people achieve these goals that they want. And if, it's a very different situation if you've never had that. I had a father who talked about work all the time. I knew what it was. I knew what the experience was. What if you didn't have that? Right. And so, I mean, I think that it's easy to understand that that's going to be harder to get to that goal if you don't even know it's there, even if you may want to. Right. So you don't know what it is. And so I think that's not about prison, though. Right. So I think it focuses on but it does say, if that's the problem, then what are we doing in the prison to fix the problem? And I think that's what Bret is talking about. And in terms of the incentives, I don't personally have a lot of problem if they have incentives to participate in the programs, provided it's not mandated. Because things can happen when you're going through a process, even if you're doing it for not 100% the right reasons. I think you can have mixed motives, and I think there's some, having an incentive to do it. I believe in learning. I believe in the light bulbs going off. I'm always struck by every time you talk to someone like in the situation, someone like Julio who's talking, that they use this language of light bulbs going off. And if you go back and you look at the theory that Ray Paternoster and I came up with, we talk about this process by which you realize, oh shoot, I don't want to do this anymore. I can do something else. Well, how does light bulbs go off? Well, you're in an environment where you're learning something, and so sometimes it's the programming itself that gets the light bulb to go off. And so I think that's what I'm okay with that. And I know, in fact, Bret, that not everybody who is in your prison system actually participates in programming, even though they have an incentive to do so. So as long as it's not everybody, because it's not, I mean, I think that, there is a situation where it's okay. And we know that when you take away that incentive, fewer people didn't participate in this program, and recidivism rates go up. So I think it's part of the process, and incentives are okay, provided they're not mandated. And I think, what do you do with children, right? I mean, it's the same kinds of things, not just little kids, older kids. Well, okay, what's going to happen if you do this? Well, that's going to be a good thing, right? And how do you achieve your own goals? Well, you give yourself rewards. Is that coercive? Yeah, a little bit, but not completely, right? Because in the end, you have to do the work and you have to go through the process. And I think that's the part that I think is okay within the context of the prison systems. But I do think that thinking about signals is an idea that I've put out there since 2012, and it still hasn't been fully understood what that means. And I'm truly troubled by the degree to which these numbers that people use about recidivism are just simply not the right numbers for the problem we're talking about when we're talking about reentry, and yet they get used over and over and over again by policymakers and academics to frame the conversation. Bret says, if my number's right, my number's right. Like if you want to focus on the people, everyone who went to prison, how many of them come back? The answer is not 53% or 60%. The answer is 33%. I mean, that's the answer. I mean, because it's a different question than the one that says, gee, who gets released today? Because that population of people that gets released today is overpopulated with people that fail a lot. And yes, that's important from Bret's perspective. You have to understand what the situation is going to be for the people that are being released. But that's not who we're talking about when we talk about reentry. We're talking about everyone who's ever had this experience. And a lot of those people succeed. And so, yes, there's going to be people that fail a lot, but we don't want to focus too much on them when we're talking about the general question of whether people do succeed after prison.
So Shawn, has anybody ever studied this 33-66 split that you're talking about? What do we know about the 66% who leave and don't come back?
I mean, first of all, you can't necessarily predict who they're going to be. They're not all the low risk guys. We find that and Bret's numbers show this too. I mean, even some people that you identify as being high risk, i.e. they had a pretty active record before, come out the other end and don't come back. So those rates at which that is true is obviously the lower rate people are more likely not to come back, obviously. But it's very interesting how hard it is to predict who those people are going to be. And that's because it's not simply a question of your initial deficits. It's a question of when you have these light bulb moments and start to move towards a different thing. And the frustrating part for everyone in the field is, well, what makes that happen? Well, the reality is, think about what made you decide to be the person you are. It's different for everyone. Right. For me,
there's a consistency across the stories. Even today, there's always a person who is at the crux of that moment where you choose something different.
But the thing that gets Julio excited was community engagement, being a community organizer, because that was hit. But it was different for everyone.
The voice of the instructor in the class.
Right.
Saying you're a community organizer.
Yeah. Anyway, I mean, so the relationship is the important part, but then it's not like if you said, okay, here's what we're going to do. We're going to go into every classroom and going to tell every single person, you should be a community organizer. No. That doesn't work, right? Because the thing that made Julio go is not what made someone else go. Right. And so everybody's going to be motivated differently. And that's really hard, because now how do you, stop trying to be prescriptive. Bret talked about this R&R model. I don't think the R&R model makes a lot of sense. It doesn't match any model of desistance I've seen. I think this the good life model that's in Europe makes some sense, and I'd like to see more thought about how that fits within the American context, because it's a human development model. It's a question of what it is that you're trying to be, but it's a fundamental choice. The thing that makes you tick is going to be different for different people, and what you got to do is find that thing that makes you tick. And the light bulb goes off for different people in different reasons, but I'm 100% convinced it's about a light bulb.
So the thing is, it's not you're a community organizer. It starts with a question, actually, of who are you?
Right.
And then people struggling with the answer to that question, and then somebody saying, well, when I listen to you talk about what you think about, what you care about, you sound like a community organizer to me. Not, oh yeah, we'll put you in the community organizing class now. It's much more of a dialogical process.
But what's really striking to me is you listen to Julio talk, and he talks about his light bulb moment. I suspect that most people listening to this talk could give a similar story about a light bulb moment where they decided to do a certain thing that was different than what they did before, whether or not they went to prison. In other words, this is fundamental part of being a human. Yeah. And so we need to stop thinking about people that went to prison as if they're somehow different. They're on the same process as everyone else, because they are like everybody else. And this experience of development, identity achievement, and I didn't make this up. This is a well-established set of principles that psychologists are well aware of. And we all transition through these set stages where we're processing this kind of churning that you were talking about. And it's the same process for everyone.
Right.
And I think that's the part that's hard for prescribers, because you want to say, well, okay, what am I going to do for everyone? Well, I don't know what I'm going to do for everyone, because the answer is going to be different. The thing that turns your clock is going to be different for everyone, but you need to be engaged in that process where you're asking that question, where you're building the relationships, and then where you're allowing people to pursue that.
Yeah. Okay, we are almost out of time, and unfortunately, I don't think we're going to get to any of the, or we are out of time, actually. We're going to get to the audience questions. We'll try to handle those in writing, so stay tuned to our webpage, and we'll try to get answers or reflections from the panelists on those questions. But I wanted to give both Bret and Julio a minute to wrap up on any thoughts that they've got that they haven't had a chance to express, or something that Shawn or I said that they want to respond to or clarify. So we'll start with you, Julio.
Oh, so just again, grateful. Thank you for the opportunity. I think, we are on target. Love the research. So I want to start just implementing some of this as well in our organizations. And maybe this outside factor that I don't know, we haven't discussed, but I just want to throw in there. The name of my organization is Exodus. So of course, I got to talk about faith. And I'm not, as we think about, does that move the barometer with someone getting out, when we know 80% of folk, who go in, those who convert usually convert to Islam. There's just another conversation that I hope we look at as well. When does that play a role in that aha moment?
Mm-hmm.
Because I think, I haven't talked about that, but it was that rekindled my sense of purpose going to the chapel. So I just want to throw that out there. Thank you.
It's a great point. Thank you, Julio. Bret?
Yeah, I just want to reiterate a point, the last point that Shawn made, which really struck me too, which is that people involved in the criminal justice system act under the same principles that everyone else as human beings act on. That really struck me, and that's not something that I mentioned before, but that really struck me in Shawn's paper too, and I really fundamentally believe. I think if you flip the question and you go back to, some theories in crime ask not why did some people get into crime, but why doesn't everyone get into crime? So it flips the question, and Julio will appreciate this. I mean, you could say from a spiritual, religious standpoint, but for the grace of God, there go I. And so I think, yes, people in the criminal justice system are just like, in a lot of aspects, just like everyone else. They're human beings, and they need to be treated like human beings and individuals, not like projects or quick problems to solve, and just getting them into the right program at the right time, the right place, but really just treating them under the fundamental principles that we treat all human beings. So that's the last point I wanted to say. But again, thanks, Shawn, and great paper.
Bret, thanks so much. That's a great word for us to end on. When we think about people in prison, we have to think about them as people, not as prisoners, not as inmates, but as people who share many of our, if not all of our hopes and aspirations and developmental processes, and that we can have more success, I think, in trying to help that 1/3 who are the frequent flyers who drive so many of the stats that get misused in this conversation, helping those who might return to prison find a new identity and a new path in life. So I want to thank Shawn for the great work on the paper. It's been so fruitful, thought-provoking for me, and helped me to think just a lot more clearly about the issues that we're dealing with. Appreciate Julio and Bret and sharing their expertise, their life experience on this topic. Rashawn Ray had to drop off to go, I think, proctor the last exam or something for his students. So, but thanks to him too for his great partnership on this incredibly important topic. For our audience, we will, as I said, be posting responses to the written questions that you submitted, And just stay tuned to AEI for more programming like this on the topic of criminal justice reform and reentry, and broadly speaking, the topic of hope. So I wish you all a very happy holiday season, and thank you again for joining us.